Dear learners, I am Christina Georgy. I welcome you to my session. In our previous session, we discussed W.B. Yeats, one of the most celebrated poems, The Second Coming, as part of Unit 13, Block 4 of our study material. Today, we will look at Unit 14, which is titled Journey of the Magi by T.S.Eliot. So, as we discussed in our last session, these two poets, namely W.B. Yeats and T.S.Eliot, are often celebrated as the modernist poets. And we also had an introduction to modernism in poetry in one of our previous sessions. Firstly, let's have a look at the life and works of T.S.Eliot. Thomas Stance Eliot, that is his full name expanded. He was one of the leading English poets of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. He was born in the USA in the year 1888 and later he settled in England. Remember, W.B. Yeats was born in Ireland and later settled in England. So, T.S. Eliot's writings can be divided into 2 phases, that is the early phase and the later phase. With respect to the early phase, it reflects an undercurrent of despair, disenchantment and disillusionment with the period after World War I. Remember, World War I happened between 1914 and 1918 and the consequences were not at all positive and optimistic. And regarding the later phase, this phase is when he wrote poems after his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism. And he wrote his poem Journey of the Magi in the year 1927. So this particular year was indeed a very important year in the life of T.S. Eliot. It was because he got his British citizenship and also he converted to Anglo-Catholicism, and hence 1927 is a very significant year in his life. And as a part of this conversion, worshipping in church became a very crucial part of his daily routine, and this in a way influenced his writings too and further led to the composition of the poem Journey of the Magi. So in our previous session we discussed how the second coming has biblical allusions and symbolism associated with it. Similarly, even this work title of T.S. Eliot has biblical associations. We look into that in course of time. Before proceeding further, let's have a quick look at a brief analysis of the writings of T.S. Eliot. Just like I mentioned W.B. Yeats, you need to make sure that you study these aspects regarding T.S. Eliot too. A quick mention of the section that we studied based on modernism in poetry. There you have characteristics of modernist poetry and related aspects. If it is an essay question that is being asked, make sure that you take up points from that section too. We have discussed all these aspects as part of the previous question paper discussion session that I've done for your batch. Okay. So, Eliot was a versatile writer, that is, his literary output spanned all literary genres. He was not only a poet but also a playwright, essayist and also a literary critic. I am very sure that you must be having some idea regarding literary criticism and theory. Eliot has put forth various theories such as objective correlative and dissociation of sensibility and many such concepts. Luckily, you don't have to study those aspects in detail. And remember, he was the leader of the modernist movement and is notably reflected in his early poems like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, The Wasteland, and the later poem, The Four Quatrains. So all these are notable works written by T.S. Eliot, and The Wasteland, never forget that name and do mention that in your answer sheets. We had a brief discussion on The Wasteland already when we discussed the first block. Another aspect to remember that he was awarded both Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Nobel Prize, I'm very sure that you will be aware of. He received the Nobel Prize in the year 1948. Study that year. He used to refer to some Hindu texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, along with the writings of Greek philosophers like Socrates and Pythagoras and others. So this is an interesting aspect regarding him. His early readings of 17th century English writers such as John Donne, John Webster, and a few other French symbolists of the 19th century helped him to find his own style. And the first poem that we discussed, the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, was the first poem that introduced a new poetic diction in English poetry. For that matter, this poem is also important. You need to know at least the title of this poem. So just the way Wordsworth and Coleridge brought to poetry the language of ordinary men, Eliot and his contemporary Ezra Pound created new diction using the contemporary speech that was neither pedantic nor vulgar. It was not rich in flowery language or vulgarity. So his early poems marked a turn in the history of English poetry. Whose early poems we are referring to? T.S.Eliot. He articulated modern themes using contemporary diction, and hence a deviation from the 19th century poetry was seen. That is called modernism in British poetry. So the most influential poems of Eliot during this period were the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Gerontion, The Wasteland, undoubtedly published in 1922, and others. So these are notable works. You need to have an awareness regarding the basic overview. Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a poem written in 1910. Remember, it was published in 1915, and it is considered to be a typical representative poem of modernism, and it also contributed to the literary movement of the early 20th century. Remember the themes: alienation, isolation, and the diminishing power of traditional sources of authority. So that was just to give you an idea regarding this particular poem. Another important poem written in 1920, Gerontion by T.S.Eliot. It is about an old man reflecting on his youthful years and the world that was undergoing rapid changes. You could see more aspects related to this poem in your study material. Due to limitations of time constraint, I am not mentioning all those aspects. So remember, after his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism, that is specifically from the year 1930 onwards, the second phase of his writing begins. In 1930, he published the next major poem, Ash Wednesday. It's important. This was followed by his mastery poem, The Four Quatrains. We discussed that. See, this is actually a compilation of four notable poems. Bond Norton, written in 1941. East Cocker, written in 1940. The Dry Salvages in 1941 and Little Jedding in 1942. Together they form the Four Quatrains. Remember, the Four Quatrains is also one of the greatest and mature poetic achievements of T.S.Eliot. And as I mentioned, he was also a renowned literary critic, and he was associated with the New Criticism. And his first play, Sweeney Agonistes, was published in 1932, performed in 1933. You may remember that. The other plays from Eliot include Murder in the Cathedral, published in 1935, The Family Reunion, published in 1939, The Cocktail Party, published in 1950, among many others. It is always advisable to remember a few, and if you could write those for the examination, fine and good. Now your study material presents the entire text of 43 lines as part of section 14.3. Due to time constraints, I am not reading out these lines, but make sure that you are familiar with these lines. I'll help you with a brief summary. Let me give you a very brief overview of this poem. Dear learners, remember, this one is a metaphorical poem. In the sense, it represents both birth and death, renewal and spiritual rebirth. For that matter, This poem uses biblical references. The very title is also connected to the Holy Bible. We'll discuss all those aspects in course of time. Just remember that this is a poem that explores the journey the wise men took when following the star to Bethlehem where Jesus Christ was born. Let's have a look at the biblical background to the poem. I told you there is this biblical symbolism associated with this poem. The stories about the early life of Jesus Christ by different writers are found in the 4 books called the Gospels, a term which means good news. The meaning of the term Gospel is good news. Sadvartha in Malayalam. So they are the Gospels of Matthew, of John, of Mark and of Luke. So what do you mean by the Gospels? These are stories about the earlier life of Jesus Christ written by writers. There are mainly 4 writers who have written the Gospels. We have the Gospels of Matthew, Gospels of John, Gospels of Mark and Gospels of Luke. Together they form the New Testament, which tells us about the birth of Jesus Christ. They also mention the teachings, the miracles and also the death, crucifixion and resurrection of Lord Jesus Christ. So this poem, Journey of the Magi, is based on the Gospel of St. Matthew. Remember, this particular poem, especially the title, is based on the Gospel of St. Matthew. We all know that Jesus was born on 25th December and he was born in Bethlehem, and the poem describes the journey undertaken by 3 wise men who traveled to witness the birth of Jesus Christ. Yes, you know this context, that is with respect to Christian dramas or Christianity. Even for your school dramas associated with Christmas, you must have had these 3 kings coming to visit baby Jesus. It's exactly the same aspect mentioned here. The word Magi is a plural form of magus, representing the 3 wise kings of the eastern world. The 3 Magi traveled to Bethlehem so as to witness the birth of Jesus Christ. So this journey is arduous as it takes place in the cold, wintry month of December. Jesus' birth heralds the dawn of a new world. We all know that he died on the cross and his disciples founded the new religion, Christianity, based on the teachings of Jesus. That's a bit of history that most of you are aware of. So his birth and death constitute a paradox, as his birth marks the death of the earlier pagan world order and his death marks the birth of a new era. At the same time, it ended the pagan religion and the world order, and also it facilitated the dawn of a new era, the Christian era. Christianity as a religion was also established. Thus, death refers to both the death of Christ and the death of the old religious order, which includes the magical power of the Magi, and birth refers to the birth of Jesus and the birth of Christianity. So, Magi visiting Bethlehem is to witness the birth of Jesus. This aspect ends the poem with an anticipation of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, in a way signaling a new Christian era. So the journey of the Magi thus becomes a renewal of hope after despair. There is this aspect of hope burning anew, optimism prevails, and the spirit of optimism is mentioned here. So in spiritual terms, the birth of a child is seen as the birth of Jesus, and his death signals the birth of a new world order. So this poem in particular focuses on the epiphany of Matthew. Epiphany means the sudden realization, and the name Epiphany comes from the Greek epiphania, meaning appearance or manifestation, and this refers to manifestation of Jesus Christ to the world. So the theme of poem is the effect of spiritual or cultural events on individual identity and society. It deals with birth, death, and also regeneration or renewal. An interesting thing is that Eliot echoes the views of Shelley. So if you have read this Ode to the West Wind, a poem written by Shelley, some of you must have studied this as part of your school days. There is this line, which is perhaps the last line of this poem: when winter comes, can spring be far behind? So this is echoed in this poem. That is, the binary happenings on earth are seen in the alternation of winter and spring, summer and winter, not to leave out day and night, morning and evening, full moon and new moon, light and darkness, so on and so forth. So birth and death are of the same binary quality. Those were contrasts, binary, that's morning, evening, the opposite of morning, evening, opposite of full moon, new moon, likewise. Okay, if you were not sure, that is what I was mentioning. The physical journey of the Magi gets transformed into his journey, spiritual journey, when he gets a deeper understanding of life as a binary alternation between birth and death, as exemplified by Jesus' birth and death and the dawn of Christianity. Now moving on to the interpretation, that is the very opening lines, which goes as a cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. So we can see that these lines with a graphic description of the harsh wintry weather are taken by Eliot from a sermon which was given by a bishop, the Anglican bishop Lancelot Andrews, in the year 1622. So these lines are also borrowed. Okay, and another important aspect regarding this poem is that this particular poem is a dramatic monologue. What do you mean by dramatic monologue? With reference to a dramatic monologue, there will be a single speaker involved, and the innermost aspects of this mind of the speaker would be revealed through this poem, and very often it is expected that there is a silent listener too. So this is a poem. A dramatic monologue is a poem written in the form of a speech by an individual character. This means there is no dialogue coming from another speaker. The another speaker is mute. It captures in a single scene the essence of what the speaker wants to express, and the speech also provides a psychological insight into the character of the speaker. That is what I already told you. The poem is addressed to a silent listener too. So, as learners of English literature, it is of great importance that you understand some of the characteristic features of dramatic monologue. This could also be a question type. With respect to your TE, there could be a question on what a dramatic monologue is. I'd like to give you an additional piece of information. If you have learned about Robert Browning at some point in time with respect to your studies, Robert Browning is a poet who used to make use of dramatic monologues throughout his career. So moving on to the chief characteristics of a dramatic monologue. There you see a character speaks in an uninterrupted flow. That is, a character keeps on speaking and is not interrupted by the other characters. The audience may be either present or absent. The speaker reveals something about his or her character or situation through the monologue. What do you mean by monologue? Single speaking, that is monologue, dialogue. Okay, it's a single speaker's dialogue basically. It's more or less a monologue. If you studied the poem My Last Duchess by Browning, you would have studied dramatic monologue. Have you studied this poem before? So you must be having an idea. So now the question comes. I told you the journey of the Magi is basically a dramatic monologue, and that I told you one speaker would be continuously speaking without any interruptions. Okay, so the speaker is one of the Magi. The singular form of Magi is Magus. So who are the Magi? We already saw that in the Holy Bible. The Magi represent three men who were called three kings or three wise men. They followed a star to witness the great event of Jesus' birth and gave baby Jesus presents. In Malayalam we say Ponnu Meerayum Kundirikkum. കാഴ്ചവെച്ചു. There are also songs related to this particular story. So what were the gifts they had taken? Gold, frankincense and myrrh. So gold is in a way a symbol of earthly kingship, whereas frankincense denotes, or more or less it's a symbol of godliness, and myrrh a symbol of death. Thus the gifts were given in recognition of Jesus' importance within the Christian story. So Jesus was known as the King of the Jews or Judeans, hence gold is offered. He was also the Son of God, hence frankincense, a symbol of godliness, is offered. And finally, he was crucified by a fanatic mob who refused to acknowledge him as the Son of God. Hence, myrrh as the symbol of death is one of the gifts bought by the Magi. So according to the Bible, crucifixion is important for Christians who believe that God sacrificed Jesus, who is his only Son, to atone for the sins of humanity. Thus we understand that this story is closely connected to Christian beliefs. As we already mentioned, there is symbolism associated with this particular poem too. If you are still not aware of symbolism, I have mentioned this many a times, that symbolism is basically used as a literary device, especially in poetry. We studied the various literary devices, and this is used to represent ideas or qualities. It can be said that it is an artistic and poetic movement or style, symbolism, that is using symbolic images and indirect suggestion to express mystical ideas, emotions and even state of mind. So this concept of symbolism originated in the late 19th century, France and Belgium. Later it began to travel to England and America, and by the 20th century, writers in England and America began to use this as a literary device. They use symbols, may that be words, people, marks, locations, or even abstract ideas, in order to represent something beyond the literal meaning. So we'll discuss a few symbols here. Firstly, we'll start with journey. The journey of the Magi to Bethlehem is undertaken to witness a glorious event. Which is the glorious event that is in discussion? Of course, the birth of Jesus. So it turns out to be a spiritual journey. The journey through the harsh windy weather is difficult, and it creates doubt as to the worth and wisdom of undertaking such a troublesome journey. So if you know the life history of Jesus, you will discover that he was born in the last week of December. To be very specific, 25th of December, and he was crucified in April. And we celebrate this, okay, we don't celebrate, we acknowledge this day as the Good Friday, and this happened in April, the spring season. Eliot had written in another poem, April is the cruelest month. Do you identify this poem by any chance? The symbolic shift from birth to death is seen in the shift from winter to spring as well. So April is the cruelest month. These lines are taken from the Wasteland. There is another symbol, Sharbat. It could be Sarbat actually, which refers to a sweet drink. It is a symbol for sensuous pleasure, and by extension pageant pleasure, which is motivated by desire for sexual pleasures. Coming to the symbol of river, we should note that water is a symbol of Jesus. That is, in the Gospel of John, it can be seen that Jesus calls himself the living water. So that is also a notable symbol. The symbol of the 3 trees low on the sky is also significant, and it has been interpreted variously by scholars to symbolize the crucifixion of Jesus, with the 2 thieves on the other 2 crosses to either side of him. So this is well renowned. That is, when Jesus was crucified, he was actually in the center, and there were 2 other thieves crucified to the left and right side of Jesus Christ. So it can also represent the Trinity, God the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit. Oh, it is written Holy Ghost in your study material. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was crucified with two thieves in an attempt to degrade him as a thief and a rebel. One of the two thieves is called the penitent thief, also known as good thief, wise thief, graceful thief, or the thief on the cross. It was this thief who requested Jesus to remember him because he more or less accepted Jesus Christ as the Son of God. There is the symbol of the white horse, which refers to someone who announces the coming of Jesus. Wine leaves are symbolic of Christ. Dicing is another symbol in the poem. The men gambling is a reference to Judas' betrayal of Christ. Remember, he betrayed Jesus Christ for 30 pieces of silver coins, and this is seen in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, lines 14 to 16. So these are some of the symbolic aspects reference to the Holy Bible as seen in this particular poem. So remember, for your TEE preparation, you need to make sure that you have an overall idea regarding the journey of the Magi. You need to know the writer. Here it's a poet because we are studying a poem. You need to know T.S.Eliot in detail and his works to a particular extent. Biblical background to the poem is of great importance, as this title also has Christian symbolism associated with this. So as part of section 14.6, you have a detailed study of symbolism in the poem. So there could be one question: how does Eliot use symbols in the gift of the Magi? Explain their significance. So this is a very probable question. Make sure that you study this in detail. So in this particular session, we discussed the basic aspects to know related to this particular poem, Journey of Magi, written by T.S.Eliot. I suppose you understood. Make sure that you study this effectively for your TE. So that's all regarding this session. In our next session, we look at another poem which is written by W.H. Auden, and it is titled The Unknown Citizen. So this falls under Unit 15 of Block 4 of our official study material.